Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Respiratory System Anatomy and Physiology. You're in Bio 212 at Norwalk Community College. And what we're doing is we are introducing chapter 23 here. And again, what I need people to remember is, yes, it's great to sit back and listen to these. But remember, it's no substitute for actually reading the text itself. Remember, I write all of my exam questions from the text material. Remember, read all the way through to the end of each paragraph. And yes, I do understand that it's a lot of material and you need to keep it straight. So that'll be the focus of these. Maybe you watch these first before you read the book, or maybe you watch these and listen in lecture and see what you can piece together and then read the book. But each student has to figure out a mechanism where they're going to be successful. Okay. Not sure what to say beyond that. So let's just dive into this. You're a living organism, and that living organism requires materials to both move into and out of the body. And the materials we're thinking about today are what is actually inside the air that you inhale and exhale to actually keep living. And by now you've figured out inside this class that really it isn't about getting the O2 in, but making sure you get the O2 out as far as I'm concerned. And that's a personal preference, and you'll see why it's a personal preference specifically to this chapter. And what I mean by that is I'm not some renegade scientist running around thinking that CO2 is the most important molecule. I am simply trying to make sure that you understand that the production of waste materials as a result of normal metabolism changes the pH inside the body, and that's what you need to understand. So the question you want to be asking yourself as you're reading this entire chapter is, what is the role of carbon dioxide in normal physiology? Normal. Okay, let's see if I can spell normal physiology. So how does this happen? Well, air comes in through the nose, travels down through the pharynx, down into the larynx, through the trachea, by passing through the bronchi and the bronchioles till we finally get to the terminal bronchioles, where finally gas exchange is going to occur. The important stuff, right? And what do I mean by that? Control Z. Let's go control that, and we're going to go UI. Oops, I just did it again. Okay, control Z. Oops, control Z. And we're going to go bang. Cool. Whoa, what the hell just happened there? Touchy. Anyway, let's see if I can figure this out before we all lose our minds here. Okay, I want to get us back to here. There we go. Fantastic. Gas exchange. We go UI. That is not working out the way it's supposed to. There we go. Okay. Now, what happened there, of course, is that what I wanted you to see is that I want you to understand that inside the alveoli, it's the alveoli you need to understand. Similar to our capillary beds in the previous exam and materials, alveoli is where materials are going to be exchanged, and the materials here are going to be carbon dioxide and oxygen, okay, as well as some water. Cool. So the nose itself, you have a nose. I'm going to just do this here. You're going to see it has an internal nares, which was fed by the external nares. And you actually have a series of sinuses as well as nasolacrimal glands, ducts that are going to open to the internal nose itself. You'll notice this when it's cold outside. You'll have a series of fluids that rush into that space to make sure that even if it's cold, you can warm the gases as they pass into the body, collect extra humidity as needed. Okay, for us to exchange gases, we have to have a certain amount of humidity. Too much makes it really hard, too little makes it really hard, but we want to have a sort of range. Okay, we're going to separate the nasal cavity by a septum. Just put your finger tip at the end of your nose and just rub your finger from side to side. You'll feel that septum. Okay, and obviously inside the olfactory epithelia, we actually smell different odorants that are chemicals that bind those receptors. Here's a cartoon you can see out here. If you close your mouth, inhale, the gases pass over all of the epithelia on the meatai, meaning it's superior, middle, and inferior, and pass back here until we actually get to the pharyngeal portion, where you actually will pass now the gases down through into the oropharynx, and the oropharynx will then feed. Okay, we're going to move down here into the actual trachea. Inhale this way, it ends up inside your stomach. Bad things usually happen with that. Inside this way, you're going to see you pass through the ventricular folds so you can actually get beyond the epiglottis into our structure here, right? So that's where the gases are going to go. Notice this is color-coded for you here, so I want you to pay attention to that. Nasopharynx feeds into the oropharynx, feeds into the laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx can support movement into both the trachea and the esophagus. The number of people who don't think that's important is actually really rather high, but think of it like this. If things that are liquid end up inside this tube, what happens to you? Okay, so I just described the larynx to you. A couple things I want to pay attention to, though, is where are the cilia found? Cilia, of course, are those modifications to the apical surface of the cell, and what's going to happen is they move in a unidirectional manner. So everything that gets trapped on those cilia has to be pushed out of your body, and you know what that feels like. You wake up in the morning coughing your lungs out. In the lab, you're going to see this model where you actually have the hyoid bone, and in living organisms, you'll actually have the hyoid membrane, right? And it's going to be attached to here the thyroid cartilage. You're going to have more of these ligaments, and what we're doing is we're creating a box, a space by which gas will pass through, and it'll vibrate these cords over here. Ventricular fold, which is the false vocal cord, okay? And you have the vocal fold, which is the true vocal cord itself. I've never tested anybody on this stuff, but I've had 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 students who wanted to go into therapy for speech pathology, and it's important to understand that if anybody can make any sound whatsoever, a coughing sound, something like that, it means the vocal folds are there and they're functional, and that's what you want to pay attention to. Okay, the trachea, we actually extends from the larynx to the superior border of thoracic 5. And you're going to divide this into left and right primary bronchi. If I was to draw that for you, let's see if I can do this without mucking it up. Okay, we're going to do something like this. Just break it off into 2 points. Oops, I just mucked it up, didn't I? There we go. And what's going to happen here, of course, is the central part is this thing that's called the carina. Okay, and it's going to bifurcate. And you can just think about branches on a tree. And those branches on a tree are going to keep going down until we actually form capillary beds where we're going to actually have gas exchange occurring. One of these days I'll figure out how to do multiple colors here and really dazzle you guys. But until then, we will just work with the basics. There we go. Let's get out of there. Oh, wrong way again. For whatever reason, I seem to have a really hard time with that. I apologize, guys. Okay. Zoom out. Can you give me some... Pause here. One of these days I'll figure this stuff out. I think it just proves that not everybody has strengths everywhere. Anyway, let's take a look at those 4 layers. You actually have a mucosa that sits on top of a submucosa, which is then supported by, for some of it, hyaline cartilage. And because it is a mucosal tissue, we know we're holding all of this in place with that adventitia. Okay, remembering back to AMP1, if you don't remember what adventitia is, I recommend you go look it up. But essentially, this is how we're holding everything together. Where are we? Let's take a look at this. Here's our esophagus. Here's our trachea. Okay? What you need to understand is that Mother Nature had to figure out a way to let things move down your esophagus, meaning the food you just ingested, okay? Close or push temporarily into the space that gases are supposed to move so you can oxygenate and remove carbon dioxide from yourself. Inside here, you'll have a fibromuscular membrane that contains the trachealis muscle. Generally speaking, what you actually have is this open space where gases will pass through. Okay, once you understand that, you're going to see that we're going to move down into the bronchi. I told you there's going to have this thing that's called the carina. It's going to support a bronchial tree where you have a secondary, tertiary, as well as bronchioles and terminal bronchioles that ultimately end up going into the alveolar system. And what I want to make sure you see here, take a look at this piece down here. Oh, look, we have, not what I wanted to do with that. Let's try that. Okay. As cartilage decreases, meaning as we move further and further away from the nose to the actual alveolar sacs, we will increase smooth muscle. And the moment you see that, you should be thinking to yourself, oh, I know what that means. I have autonomic nervous system control over the functioning of the lungs, and that's completely correct. You'll see sympathetic autonomic nervous system activation causes a dilation or relaxation of smooth muscle. This is the opposite of the way you would normally think of it. Simultaneously, you could have parasympathetic activation, and that parasympathetic activation actually causes contraction and constriction. Okay, so this is one of those nudge, nudge, hint, hint, wink, wink moments when you're reading this going, hey, this isn't normally the way we see these systems functioning, so why might Mother Nature be doing this? So here's that branching I was telling you. There's the larynx, there's the trachea, there's the carina branching off. And you actually have the, let's see what word textbook is going to call these things. So here is the secondary bronchus here, which means this is our primary bronchus, which means our tertiary bronchi will be over here. But ultimately, gas exchange is going to happen way down here in all three directions. Think about those things traveling as roots throughout the body. The lung itself actually is surrounded by a double layer of pleural membranes. And remember back in AMP1, I made a big deal out of this so that friction could be reduced. If you're inhaling and exhaling a soft tissue like your lungs, you want to surround it with something, and you'll actually have a visceral pleura that covers the lungs themselves, and you'll have a parietal pleura that lines the thoracic cavity, and then you're going to put in that pleural fluid to reduce friction. Let's see if I can do this without making everything disappear this time. Yes! Fantastic. Okay? But here's the tricky part. Yes, it's reducing friction, but guess what? It increases surface tension. So as you literally, what happens for us to actually inhale, we actually pull the lungs larger, and I'll explain how that happens in a minute. Okie dokie then. So let's take a look at this. Here's that visceral pleura here. Here's obviously the parietal pleura lining the thoracic cavity, and there's going to be fluid inside there. And if you can use your imagination for a second, just fill all of those spaces up with fluid. That fluid doesn't get in the way of gas exchange because it's not in here. It's around here. So as you inhale, what happens is all of these move outward and they pull all of this space open. And what that does is it literally pulls gases into the lungs itself. If here's our esophagus, you know the trachea has to be around there somewhere. Although I actually don't see it in this. Here's our esophagus. There's the aorta. The trachea has to be, see, right here. So that means as you're inhaling, you're pulling all of that space away. Gas is now being pushed into that space. Okay? Cool. Let's finish this off by explaining the mechanics, and then we'll stop and we'll pick up with some of the physiology. So here's your lungs. Drawn for you here, you can see the right lung has a horizontal fissure as well as this oblique fissure, whereas the left lung has a cardiac notch and an oblique fissure. That's really important inside lab. 10% lower surface area inside this left lung as a result of that cardiac notch. Upshot, of course, is going to be as deoxygenated blood travels into the lungs, oxygenated blood returns to the actual heart itself. And to see this, okay, really, we don't really care about what's traveling back to the heart right now. We want to know how it gets reoxygenated. And what's going to happen is that oxygenated oxygen, that was great, wasn't it? The air travels in, carrying in large quantities of oxygen and very little carbon dioxide. And what happens is carbon dioxide now moves out of the capillary beds surrounding all of this. Okay, and oxygen now moves into the capillary beds surrounding all of this. But how does it all move? You surround it with elastic connective tissue. So as this is stretched, these guys get stretched. And you can imagine, just put the ends of your fingertips together and just keep pulling them apart and pushing them together as if they are in one big elastic band. Also take a look at all the lymphatic vessels here. Everything you've inhaled in the course of a day, a percentage of it is going to end up inside your lungs. And this is a warm, moist environment for everything and anything that wants to turn you into dinner will live. So what you do, of course, is you flood the system with traveling lymphatic tissues. And what I mean by that, of course, is macrophages for non-specific antigen identification. And it runs back now to the lymph nodes. So let's finish off this by thinking about what an alveoli is. And these are cup-shaped outpouchings that are made up of two types of cells, type 1 alveolar cells and type 2 alveolar cells. And that's where I'll stop. We'll actually pick up at this slide when we come back.